Right, what I'd like to do now is, having gone through the approach with you, is actually just give you some insights on how you could actually use these results and how you can actually benefit from undertaking a rapid assessment of wetland ecosystem services in terms of different aspects to do with wetlands and obligations under the Ramsar Convention. So there's a whole range of purposes that you could use this for. So, for instance, updating Ramsar information sheets. Those of us who are responsible for managing Ramsar sites, you know, every 6 years you are duty bound under the obligations of the Convention to update your Ramsar information sheets. And just out of interest, because I'm interested in wetlands and I'm interested in Ramsar, on a Wednesday evening when we all finished here, I went back to my hotel room and I downloaded all the Ramsar information sheets for the Ramsar sites that we have managers of in this room. And when you look at the ecosystem services listed on your Ramsar information sheets, which are currently available on the Ramsar website, I would guess that you've underestimated them for every site I looked at. So I think it's a suggestion for you when you go back home to look at your Ramsar information sheets, look at this approach and think, next time I update it, maybe it could be slightly more comprehensive. In terms of site management planning, if it's a Ramsar site, then under the Ramsar Convention, the obligation is to maintain the ecological character. And the ecological character includes wetland ecosystem services. That's one of the 3 elements of ecological character. So it's quite useful in terms of management planning. If you can't define the ecological character, how can you manage your site because you don't know what you're trying to maintain? But it's also a lot of the services, especially provisioning services, are related to livelihoods. So in terms of understanding livelihoods and managing the potential threats that arise from livelihood conflicts. So that's a useful process in terms of site management, management planning. You can use the assessments for that process. Sometimes if people have to deal with impact assessments, so something is suggested, a development is suggested near a Ramsar site or near another wetland. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Ramsar site. It could be a development for a road or for infrastructure or for water abstraction or agricultural change. And again, you can use this to look at, well, what would happen with that change? Would we lose services or would we maybe gain services? Would beneficiaries miss out? Who would suffer or who would benefit from a change? In terms of designing CEPA, communications, education, participation, public awareness programs, again, the more people you can communicate to about the multiple values of the wetland, the more people will begin to appreciate those values and recognise those values and think about those values. And so, again, you can use this to help design CEPA programs and activities. And you can also use this approach in looking at maybe strategic planning over a wider area. So maybe if you're looking at water allocation across a catchment, or you're looking at planning across a region of your country, it might be a city, or it might be a certain region where you're looking at, well, which wetlands have I got? You might even tie this to a national wetland inventory and what services are those wetlands providing. So you can use it in a much more strategic context. So there's many applications that you could use this approach for. In terms of the RAS updates, there's a similar sort of scoring system on the updates. It's a qualitative system, it's not a quantitative system. The services follow exactly the same categories, and I was one of the people that was responsible for the ecosystem services update, the change on the Ramsar information sheet when that was brought in. So we've made sure that the design of this is compatible with the Ramsar information sheets. And again, it requires guesstimates. It doesn't talk about absolutes and quantification. So it fits very nicely with the Ramsar information sheet updates. Or equally, if you're designating new sites for identifying what goes into the Ramsar information sheet. Management planning, maintaining and defining the ecological character, incredibly important. And because basically, if we go back to the text of the convention says that we need to maintain the ecological character if we want to achieve wise use. And if we can't understand the ecological character, which includes ecosystem services, we can't deliver wise use. And there are three elements which we'll see: components, processes, and benefit services. So it is essential to understand the ecological character of any Ramsar site, or actually any wetland. And so when we look at the ecological character of wetlands, we're normally quite good at talking about the ecosystem components. Most of us think of our sites in terms of the area, the types of habitat, the number of birds, number of plants, animals, etc. So the ecosystem component bits we're quite comfortable with. And if you look at Ramsar information sheets, there's usually good information on that. Equally, when you think about the 9 designation criteria for Ramsar sites, they're all ecological component criteria. We're less good at looking at ecosystem processes, but there's usually something in there. And normally the area where we suffer in terms of the descriptions within describing the ecological character of a Ramsar site, so when you look at management plans on those sites that have management plans, quite often the ecological character focuses on this lot and doesn't really cover these. Now, some of these processes get picked up under the supporting services. And by using this sort of approach, you're almost forced, when you're looking at the supporting services and how they support these other services, you have to start thinking about processes as well. So by undertaking this approach, it gives you a much more robust description of ecological character, because you're forced to think about processes. You can't just think about the services in isolation. And this was one of the reasons we kept supporting services in the assessment. So by doing this at your site, you can actually get a much stronger, more robust definition of ecological character, and that can help with managing and maintaining that in your site. In terms of managing wetlands, a lot of the ecosystem services are linked to benefits that the local community get, which might be livelihoods, but some of those might actually be threats. So for instance, I've worked on several sites where fisheries are both seen as a benefit and overfishing is seen as a threat, where fuelwood collection might be a benefit, but it's also a threat. And so by understanding these services and linking them to who benefits, it gives you an opportunity to maybe get involved in those livelihood systems and to put in place management activities which will maintain the service at a sustainable level so it doesn't become a threat. And I'm sure you can think of examples from your sites where you might have services, and it is usually the provisioning ones, but they can also be a threat. But it might be a regulating service. You might have a wetland that's very good at regulating water quality, but actually what's happening is it's now becoming eutrophic. You might have gone from a nice clear water system that's now getting dominated by algae because it's actually got too much nutrient coming into it. Or we were having a conversation over the coffee break just now where you might have good erosion protection, sedimentation going on, but your wetland actually starts filling up with sediment and you start losing other services. So if some of those other services then affect livelihoods, usually what that means is people will try and do something else which could also be a threat to your wetland. So you can use this, and you can probably think of examples in your own head where a service might become a threat. The other thing which is good about taking this approach, and especially if you look at a site, as we've done here in St John, where you look at different components of a site. You don't just do one assessment for a whole Ramsar site. Now that might be relevant in Singapore, where your wetland is the size of one of these desks, because they're very small in Singapore. But if you're in Indonesia and you've got a huge peat swamp forest that covers a third of one of your islands, well, you might want to break that up into smaller areas. And so you can start looking at spatial issues and how these services might vary from area to area and who would benefit. And that can give you guidelines in terms of how you would integrate those people, those beneficiaries into management planning, how they become stakeholders in decision making. But equally, it might be that some of these services vary over time. And an example I'll present shortly will show how, by understanding some of the services, especially the provisioning services, knowing that it might be certain activities such as harvesting of certain plants, collection of medicinal plants, or even hunting, which is in as a service, because it's still the collection of food or ornamental resources. If it's sustainable, it can be a positive service. If it's not sustainable, it becomes a threat. It's still a livelihood to those people, but it's a threat to the site. That might only happen at certain times of the year, but by understanding that, that's when you might want to put your intervention in terms of might be patrolling or in terms of engagement with local communities. And again, I'm sure there's things that you can think of from sites that you know where the services won't be static over the whole year or the same over a whole site. And again, understanding these spatial and temporal variations, you can use this approach just to get you thinking. And I will stress this several times. We don't see this as a tool that you just use once and it gives you one set of answers for one solution. It's very much an approach. And ultimately, whether you put down 1 plus 2 plus 0 minus double minus question mark, to me, as long as you've gone through the thought process, that is far more important than the absolute scoring. Because it's really getting people to think about the connection between the service, how the processes maintain that service, and who benefits. And part of that thinking should be thinking about differences across a site in space, but also differences in time. And that time might not be over the course of a year, it might be over the course of many years if you're seeing maybe slow, gradual changes in your site. So for instance, tourism might be seen as in the short term, you might have seasonal variation over a year, where you might have certain periods of the year when you get many, many visitors, and that's seen as a positive. But then when you look at that over long term, it might be if those visitors are increasing and increasing in number, your service is becoming a threat, rather than actually, it's still the service is doing really well, but actually other things on the site would be suffering. And also, you can use it to understand impacts. So if you don't know the benefits and you don't know who is benefiting, you might not understand who suffers an impact. And so it might be that people lose out because you've changed the management of the site. If you're not aware of the service and who's benefiting from that service, then you won't recognise that there's an impact. So, and again, if you're going to follow the Ramsar approach, which is looking to avoid impacts and to mitigate and then compensate, if you don't know the service and who benefits, you might not be able to avoid that. But if you do know, then you might not be able to avoid the impact, but you might be able to look at better mitigation or better compensation. And I think one of the great values of this is using it for CEPA. And it might be that there are certain campaigns or programs you develop or information, interpretive materials. And that the number of wetland sites I go around and you look at the interpretation, and it normally focuses on a few key things, which is great. But again, I think part of our role as wetland managers is to communicate the multiple benefits and make society aware that wetlands aren't just great places to go and see birds, or that they just do one or two things, but really to talk about a whole range of benefits. And so it gives you an opportunity to develop interpretive materials and to engage with different stakeholders, because part of the communications isn't just about public awareness, it might be about raising awareness of other stakeholders, which might be other government ministries. So you might want to have a conversation with your irrigation department or with your fisheries department, because you're now aware that your services are really important for maintaining irrigated water, for maintaining fisheries or tourism. So it might open the door to conversations with other government stakeholders or local communities. And that gives you the opportunity to influence policy makers. And the point I think I made on Wednesday was sometimes if you want to influence a policymaker, if you say my wetland is worth $100 million, some policymakers might say, okay, it's worth $100 million. I'm going to put a hotel that's going to be worth $200 million. My hotel trumps your wetland. But if you say to the same politician, my wetland supports the livelihood of 50,000 people because of these services, and 50,000 people vote for you as a politician and you change my wetland, you're not going to get elected. They might listen to that message a little bit better than the 100 million story. So if you can talk to policymakers about how the wetland will affect them, you can really influence policymakers. If you go to an irrigation department and say, our bird numbers of, I don't know, Sarus crane are reducing year on year, they'll go, who cares? I need water for my irrigated agriculture. But if you say, by the way you're managing my wetland, all these other people are suffering and agriculture is being reduced in other areas, and there are other impacts on these services, then you might have a better dialogue. So you can use it to influence policymakers. It changes the language that you might use to discuss things with different policymakers, different decision makers in different sectors. So it just basically increases your opportunity to engage with different people using their language, maybe rather than your language. In terms of strategic planning, and I'll come on to an example of this shortly, when you've got many wetlands over an area, it might be a catchment, it might be a coastal zone, it might be within an administrative boundary. You can use this approach because it's rapid. You can cover many, many sites quite quickly, and you can build up a picture of the multiple values of those sites. And again, you can use this to inform policymakers. And so you don't necessarily have to forget about maybe the biodiversity values. You might have a series of wetlands over, let's say, a district boundary, which people know are really important for certain birds or mammals or fish or whatever. So you can keep those biodiversity arguments and still use those to influence people, but it gives you a whole load of other things to talk about in terms of multiple values. And you can integrate these things into things like strategic environmental assessments, strategic water management plans, agricultural development plans. And again, I'm sure you can think of possible examples where you could do this. So there can be many ways to use this approach. It's not just a sort of single focused approach. You could apply it in different contexts. And you can use the results in many different ways. And what you've done so far is basically just have a field sheet which you've marked on. But you can actually take that information and utilize how you use that information in different ways. And I'm going to present some examples. So you can use it just to have a visual impression of maybe different wetland types or different services. And sometimes to communicate with certain audiences, just using a color coding system where red is seen as bad and green is seen as good and maybe orange is seen as sort of in the middle, can be enough to demonstrate to people we have this wetland which has got lots of really good things going on. This wetland, because you're treating it badly, has less good things going on. But also because the data we're collecting is on a 5-point scale, so double plus, single plus, zero, minus, double minus, you can convert that into a numerical scale. And whilst if you had statisticians in the room, from a really statistical point, there's a lot of analysis you can't do if you really wanted to sort of prove statistics on it. From a representative point of view, you can use it to represent ideas, and I'll show you some examples. And you can combine that with maps, and combine the data with maps, and you can come up with simple narratives, just written text, which you might not have been able to do before you actually had this approach. So I'm going to present very quickly just some examples, and these are real examples where we've used this approach recently over the last couple of years. 3 of them are from this part of the world, and one of them is literally I was working on only last week, and I just thought it would be a useful one because it's about potentially designating a Ramsar site. So there's some work we've been doing looking at the wetlands around the Yellow Sea. There's a site in Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia in Europe, which is part of the Balkans, where I was last week, how we're looking at designating this as a Ramsar site, and I've been working with the local stakeholders to look at the multiple benefits of this site. But I also want to focus a bit more detail on two studies, one from Sri Lanka, which is looking at producing a wetland management plan for Colombo, and the other one is for site management planning at Muinji in Myanmar. So this is, we ran exactly the same sort of course, a workshop, a couple of years ago, when we had colleagues from China and from elsewhere around the Yellow Sea in Korea. And we asked people to go back to their wetlands and use the technique. And this is some colleagues in China from Panjin. And basically, just visually, you can just color code it. And you can look at that already, and you can see we have 5 different types of wetland. And we can see that the natural salt marsh, there's a lot more dark greens, a lot more double pluses. So in terms of regulating and provisioning services, you can see that the natural salt marsh provides a lot more benefits. The aquaculture pond is primarily not providing regulating services, and where it does, they're negative, and actually some of them are double negatives. And so just visually, just by colour coding it, you can use this as a way to as a communication tool. Really simple. And what I'm going to do at lunchtime when you're all enjoying yourself, I'm going to take your results and do exactly the same. And just immediately, you can start picking out differences across different parts of the wetland. And so we did this for several sites around the Yellow Sea as part of we did a literature review as well, but also looking at what are the ecosystem services being provided by the tidal wetlands around the Yellow Sea coast of China and the Korean Peninsula. Just to understand that if we carry on infilling and losing these tidal wetlands, what services is society losing? And so that's just a really simple way, by using a simple colour coding of dark green for a double positive, light green for a single, yellow for nothing, then orange for a single negative and red for a double negative. And you just immediately, you can pick out patterns. No quantification, no monetisation, but just immediately you can start getting an idea that different wetland types are providing different types of services. Yeah, question there. Norman, do we have a microphone?
So we have studied, we assessed different types of ecosystem and found different results over there. Some ecosystems have enough provisioning, and some had cultural and supporting type of ecosystems rather than provisioning. So my question is that how we can integrate these all values for the sentient ecosystem.
Yeah. So the question is, if we're looking at all these different components, how do we bring it all together? I will show you an example in a minute. You're about 2 slides too early, because I will answer that question in about 2 slides' time. But yeah, so what you have is different types of wetland within one bigger wetland complex. So how do you bring it all together and balance it? There are ways you can do that. One of the things I would say is it depends what you want to communicate and who you're communicating to. And so, again, you should choose the way you're going to present the data depending on what sort of conversation or what sort of communication you want. But there are ways we can do it, which we'll look at. But that's just a simple way of visualizing. Now, what you can do, I mean, that's just showing that sort of the natural salt marsh is coming out in terms of overall services, probably providing the greatest service. So it would beg the question, why do we lose natural salt marsh if we think it's going to provide more services? So one of the ways we've looked at doing this, and there's examples of this elsewhere in the scientific literature, is because we've got a 5-point scale, we can turn that into a numerical scale. And so we can say a double plus is 1, double minus is -1, single plus 0.5, 0, 0, single minus 0.5. This is a completely dimensionless scale. It doesn't mean that one is double, a double plus is double a single plus. So it's a dimensionless scale. So you can't get absolutes out of it, but it gives you an indication. And by using this approach, by converting from our double pluses, single pluses to that, we can then start doing some analysis. We can start summing things. We can add them together. We can do some sort of a presentation on it. And you can use Excel. You don't need any fancy software. You don't need to download a package from the internet and then once you download it, spend the next 6 months trying to work out how to use it. You can just do this in Excel. And so what I've done is you can set up sheets that basically, you can have one sheet that has your assessment like that, and then the next columns can just say if it equals 0, then in that cell, in the next column it goes 0. If it says if it reads a double plus, you just put in a 1. And you can just set that spreadsheet up really simply. And so you can convert from that scale to a 1 to -1 scale very simply. And once you've got numbers, and again, you must remember these are dimensionless. They don't mean something's worth double the other or 4 times the other or whatever. You can start using it. And so, as an example, this is some work we did based on that work on the LSE wetlands. And this was already an evaluation which we did here on Saint-Chom before. And what we did is we took several groups of people, much like we've done with yourselves, and we just said, okay, if we just add those values for all the different types of wetland around, so for the reed swamp, for the tidal flats, and we say, okay, we've had 5 groups doing the analysis, let's just add, you've said it's a 2 plus, that's a 1. You've said it's a 1 plus, that's a 0.5. You've said it's a 1 minus, that's a minus. You add them together, and then you take all the different parts of the site and add it all together. You end up, for the different services, with your scores. And then what I've done here, the bars show that there is a variation between the different assessments. So some people have called it a 1, some have called it a 0. But it gives you a picture for all, and this is for all the tidal wetlands, so this is for a whole range of different types of wetland, that actually, overall you can see that the supporting services are incredibly important. It's a positive value. Disease regulation was coming out as negative, and this was because of this issue with avian influenza, which the group that we had felt was quite a strong issue in terms of disease. But again, we're picking up the cultural services are very important because of the educational values of this area. But the provisioning services are really far less important. And you can do that by adding those different sites together using a very simple nominal scale. What you're saying is you're not saying that because that column is up there and this column is up there, that is 3 times more important. You're not saying that. You're just saying that relatively, that these services are more important. But you can also, because we've got the error bars, you can see where we actually had quite good consensus. So for the supporting services, there's no error. All the groups were saying the same thing. Whereas if you look at noise and visual buffering, we had great variation. And again, so you can focus in terms of learning, in terms of training and looking at knowledge gaps by using this approach as well. But that's just a simple addition of these nominal dimensionless numbers. And so that just gives you an overview of the wetlands of Saint-Chom Bay. And we did the same for Panjin and for a couple of other sites around the LOC. And then one of the things we didn't do earlier on, because it would have taken too much time, was start looking at the scale. So we've got these 3 scales: local scale, regional, or global. Or again, you might want to modify that for your context. You might want to have local, you might want to have country, or you might want to have a city, or whatever it is you're working on. And again, what we did is the dark colours, so are the local, the lighter colours are regional, and the very pale is global. Again, you can see that the supporting services were very much of local benefit. And again, this was just adding up the number of them. So this was just giving, so each one a value of 1. So if you had a local, it was 1, global, it was 1, and you just add them up for different types of site. And so you can see that the provision of habitat was seen as globally important, And that was a maximum number. We had 5 as a maximum, so I think we had 5 different groups, or 5 different wetland types, sorry. And you can see that some of the cultural services are of global importance, but the regulating services are all of local importance. And again, it gives you that spatial variation in terms of the scale of who benefits. And all we've done here is for each one of global, regional, local, scored it 1. So for our 6 types of wetland we looked at in Suncheon Bay, the maximum score you could get would be 6. And if you scored a service as being local for all 6 different types of wetland, that would score a 6. Or you might want to divide that and have it as a 1 or as a percentage. But again, so this gives us an idea in terms of the wetlands of Suncheon. Regulating services are very much of local benefit. Very much the local communities benefit from those. Cultural, there's a much broader range of people who benefit. And some of the supporting are global, some of them are very much on the local level. And again, you can do that just by using a very simple number and adding the numbers across different wetland types within an area. Did that sort of make sense? I mean, what you can't do is you can't give absolutes. You can't say that that is so much more important because that scored 6 out of 6 and that scored 2 out of 6. You're not saying that's 3 times more important or less important. You're just saying it gives you an indication. And so that sort of approach is really good for just visualization and for communication. This is an example that I was working on only a week ago. Well, I've been working on this for a couple of years. This is Lake Ohrid in Macedonia. It's the oldest lake in Europe. It's about 1.6 million years old. It's continuously been a lake for 1.6 million years. And it's incredibly important because of that. It has a high level of endemism. There's fish species, insect species that just only live here and live nowhere else on the planet. And we've been trying to get it designated, but also there used to be extensive marsh communities that went round the lake, and they've pretty much all gone. There's only one small area of marsh left, which we're also trying to get designated as part of a bigger Ramsar site. But the government are saying, well, the marsh isn't important, and the local government are saying the marsh isn't important. The reason the local government are saying that is they want to build hotels on it, because it's one of the last bits of flat land left. And so I was out there last week, and what we did is, this is the marsh community, and the lake has huge cultural importance, recreation, tourism. Whereas the marsh is sort of seen as this rather sort of wet, horrible area that just is full of disease and no one wants to go there, so let's fill it in and build hotels. And so what we did is we went out, myself and a whole load of colleagues last week, and we did the rapid assessment, exactly as you've done, just to try and demonstrate to the stakeholders and to the government that actually both the lake and the marsh have their own sets of values and they're important. People benefit from them. And again, what we did an assessment for the lake and an assessment for the marsh. And here we combined all the regulating services, all the provisioning services, just to show that if you plot it as a sort of graph, and this is using this scale, so we're putting everything between -1 and +1, that actually the green, which is this small area of marsh, which only covers about 50 hectares, the lake covers vast, vast area. It's probably less than 1% of the whole of the potential Ramsar site. In terms of provisioning services, the marsh was actually more important. In terms of supporting services, the marsh provided a lot more services than the actual lake did. But when you plot it, and there's different ways to present the same data. Here I've used a spider diagram. It's using the same data, but it's just different visualization techniques. And this shows that the cultural services are very, very important for the lake, less so for the marsh. And you can just combine the data and just use visualization techniques and this is combining it under provisioning, regulating, cultural and supporting. I mean, we can break this down into the individual services as well. But the key thing was to try and communicate. And then what we did is we produced spider diagrams for provisioning services, regulating services, and also the cultural and supporting. And you can show, again, using these sort of spider diagrams, that different services, the lake and the marsh, provide different services. And if you lose one part of it, or don't protect one part of it, you lose some of those services. You've got to think of it as a system, that these work together. Whether it's on the regulating, so here you can see that ornamental resources were important from the lake, but not from the marsh. But because of the supporting services, some of those supporting services supported the ornamental services in the lake. And likewise, if you look at the cultural services, the lake was much more important in terms of cultural services. And in terms of the sporting services, they were similar in terms of the patterns. The one that was seen much more important was the soil formation within the marsh. And you can use this just to try and communicate messages. Very simple visualization techniques. It's not statistically robust, but it just gets the message across to people. So before I move on to this, any questions on that first bit? So does that answer your question on how you can actually do it? And it's very simple, and it doesn't necessarily stand up to statistical analysis if you want really detailed statistical analysis, but it's good for visualization. This work, which we did on Colombo, we have actually published, and the statistics in this was accepted in a peer-reviewed journal. So you can actually use it even if you put the right caveats in place. Yes, sure.
Can you assign different values to device?
Yeah, so for this sort of exercise, we use the +1, +0.5, 0. You can do 150, you can do whatever you want. You can do 1, 2, 3, 4. The outcome remains the same. I mean, we've tried the presentation. One of the ways we did it initially was a double plus was 5, single plus was 4, a 0 was 3, then 2, then 1. It's all a relative scale.
Also, like if you want to show like distribution of the percentage, you
Yeah.
can also show that.
You can, yeah. So, because all you're doing is you're not talking about absolute values. These are still just relative, and it's a way to visualize those relative values. It's a way to take that nominal scale and be able to use it so you can create graphs, basically, or other communication material. And we'll look at some others in a minute. I was involved a few years ago with, I led a team of people producing a wetland management strategy for Metropolitan Colombo. For those that know Colombo, it's a city built on wetlands. Wetlands are the lifeblood of the city. And over the years, through, I think, very ill-informed management decisions, the wetlands have been filled in. And as they filled the wetlands in, there's been a whole load of loss of services and benefits. And one of the main ones has been the loss of flood storage. And so consequently, Colombo has started investing in a lot of heavy infrastructure, embankments, flood pumps, the usual things that happen, borrowing money from the World Bank to try and reduce flooding. And the team I was leading was asked to produce this wetland management strategy, and part of that was to look at the multiple values of these wetlands. Now, we looked at 63 different wetland sites in the city of Colombo, and we did a rapid wetland ecosystem assessment on these 63 sites, just to try and understand what are the values. And very much on the approach that I talked about 2 days ago, we did this as the bottom qualitative assessment. We then moved up a little bit, and on some of these sites, once we had the information from the rapid assessment, we did some quantification. And we did different techniques, going out, working with stakeholders, discussion groups, participatory groups, where we collected additional data on specific services. And then for some of those services, we monetized them. So this took the whole pyramid. But I just want to focus on the rapid assessment and what this told us. And when it actually came to presenting the results, and I had to present to the National Wetland Committee in Sri Lanka on this, I didn't use any of the monetization or the quantification. I only used the results of this to communicate the importance of these wetlands. And these are, when you're looking at an area across a city or if it's across a country, you get great variation in the wetlands. There are some wetlands which are absolutely wonderful, despite the fact this wetland has a major problem with an invasive species. You have some wetlands which I'm sure we've all pictured wetlands like that before, sadly. Others that have been converted into what people think of as really good. This is great for flood storage. We just create a tank. Others have educational values. There's rice agriculture in the city. Some are wooded, some are open. So a great variety of wetlands. Looking at these 63 different wetlands, if you combine all the results from the 63, so very much the question you are asking, what we see is that the dark greens are the double pluses, light green single plus, and then I've taken out the zeros because that's not happening, and then the reds are a single minus and the purple is a double minus. Well, what you can see is across the city, if you look at all the wetlands, they're all providing a huge amount of benefits. And then we thought, okay, well, they're all providing benefits. Some of them are providing disbenefits. There's a service in here which we've since taken out. My colleague Mark Everard and myself have been having I will say a debate. Occasionally it's an argument. Sometimes it's a debate. Then it becomes an argument. Then it becomes a debate. I don't think waste disposal is a service. Mark has argued that it is. I'm very fortunate now because when this draft resolution on this went to Standing Committee of the Ramsar Convention 2 weeks ago, almost unilaterally every party said take out waste disposal, it's not a service, it's a threat. So I feel vindicated and I can now tell my colleague Mark Everard, I was right, you were wrong. So it makes me feel good. So if we ignore this one, but fresh water was seen, this was because some people were taking water which wasn't fresh. It was a negative. So they wanted to take water and they couldn't because the water wasn't fresh. It was seen as they were sort of a victim because they couldn't take the water. It was there, but they couldn't take it. But overall, the wetlands were very, very positive. And so just using this as a visualization technique, just to say to people, look, your wetlands in Colombo are providing all of these services. But then we went one step further. We said, well, who benefits from that? The dark green is local, and we took local to mean around the wetlands and within Colombo. So the citizens within metropolitan Colombo. The green was within Sri Lanka, and the very pale green was global. And what we showed is the majority, if not all of the services, even when they're only of small significance, and this was a count from 0 to R63, almost all the sites are providing these sort of top services, so climate regulation, local food, air quality regulation, pollination, water regulation. What we were showing is the people that benefited were the people living in Colombo. So why would you lose those wetlands and convert them into buildings, hotels, housing, whatever, when you're actually taking a benefit away from the local community? What city leader would ever think that would be a sensible thing to do? You are robbing the existing generation and future generation of those benefits, because the majority of them are local benefits. This is global climate regulation, which unsurprisingly has a large global element, which is why that sticks out as an anomaly. The provision of habitat is because there are some nationally rare species and also globally rare species. And when you convert that into graphs, combining these across the different types of services, provisioning, regulating, what you can show is there are subtle differences, but overall, and this was just using a nominal scale, turning that into a percentage, if you add the city and the local, you're looking somewhere in excess of 90-95% of the benefits from the wetlands are enjoyed and delivered to the people of Colombo. And so if you lose these wetlands, it is the very people you're trying to improve their lives by losing the wetlands are the ones that are suffering. And from a city management point of view, that makes no sense. Absolutely no sense. But that was the trajectory that Colombo was on. It was losing these wetlands because they thought, we can put up a property, we can get economic development, everyone benefits. Well, by doing that, actually everyone loses out as well. And there are some subtle differences in terms of the different services. And this is, again, without any quantification and without any monetisation. It's just using the information as quite a powerful communication technique. You can then get really, really clever. and do some sort of hierarchical clustering. One of the things I was interested in was, do you have similar types of wetland that provide similar groups of services? And using statistical techniques, this is hierarchical agglomeration, you can actually group the wetlands by the services they provide.
In previous slide, there is a city in provisioning service. There is a in city and local.
Yeah.
So I didn't understand
the difference. Yeah. Yeah. We defined local as people literally living within 200 metres of the wetland. So it's people living around the edge of the wetland or inside the wetland in some cases. City was within Metropolitan Colombo, so the administrative district of Metropolitan Colombo. So the local people are actually a subset of the city people. And so you can add the two together and say these are people living in Colombo. But we just did an arbitrary sort of 200 metres around the wetland. But then what we also looked at is, do you get little clusters of different types of services? And so if you're trying to manage for different services in terms of the benefits that come from them, are there certain wetlands that are more important than others for the services they provide? And what we found is that there was a clustering. And you could say, well, actually, if you restore these sort of wetlands, these are the benefits that you can put back into the system. So rather than saying, let's protect all if we say all the wetlands are important, they're all providing multiple benefits, some are providing different suites of benefits, so you need to protect all these different wetlands because they're not all doing the same thing, and that's exactly what we've seen here in Suncheon. Different wetlands do different things, they provide different benefits. But if you want to improve certain benefits, if you want to restore, then you need to restore certain types of wetland which will give you certain types of services. And so before I go, so I had to present this to the National Wetland Committee, and one of the things we had been asked to do is a wetland management strategy. Was there, currently in Metropolitan Colombo there is a zonation, so different wetlands have different classes, different types. And what that zonation is actually it's which wetlands can be filled in, which wetlands can't be filled in. That's what it basically means. It's basically saying these ones are less valuable than these ones. And we were asked to look at that current, I think it's a 6 or 7-fold classification, and come up with our own zonation based on our work. So I presented a map to the government of Colombo, but also to the National Wetland Committee. And that was basically the map underneath that, the grey areas. I said, that's your zone, that's wetlands. They went, yeah. I said, no, that's the zone. There's only one zone. Because all of the wetlands are important. They're all providing different benefits to different people. We can't subdivide that into which are more important than others, because they're all important to people. And the people just sat there and went, that's only one zone. I went, oh, hang on, there is a second zone. And everyone went, oh, great, there's a second zone. Maybe that's the one we can build on. I went, and these are the wetlands you need to restore, to put a lot of those benefits back into people. Because as soon as you say one wetland is more valuable than another, and the way I did this, I got 6 most important people in the room to stand up. And I said to the first one, you're the least important. We've now filled you in. Sit down. We now have 5 types of wetland left. So to the 5th person, okay, you were the second least valuable, you're now the least valuable. We're now going to fill you in. And you work along, and I left the big chief who was in the room as the last person standing, and I said, and now do you feel threatened? Because as soon as you put a relative value on all of these and say one is more important than the other, what you're basically saying is that is less valuable. You're not and you forget the fact it is still valuable. And so that's the approach we took. And what we said is all wetlands in Colombo are valuable. They're all providing these services, and the services are normally benefiting the local people. And fingers crossed, it's looking like this is now going to go forward, and the wetlands will be protected in Colombo. And there is actually, when I was there about 4 or 5 weeks ago, there is a ministerial document which is basically putting forward a law that will protect all the wetlands in Colombo based on this analysis. So it can be very powerful and very effective, and that was really without a lot of quantification or monetisation. Any questions on that Colombo example? And that is written up in a paper which I can circulate and allow people to have, and also the wetland management strategy that came from that is available online as well. Yeah.
Didn't the government officials look for more robust study? They need more evidence.
No, that was enough evidence. Just to use that. And interestingly, they weren't asking for monetary. Initially, they wanted monetary values. That was part of the remit, and we did that for certain surfaces. And we did some quantification as well without monetising it for certain services. But I think it was the message that all these wetlands were important, and that the importance wasn't for some sort of global biodiversity, it was for the local people. And I think that's what really struck a chord, that they realised that by filling these wetlands in, they are making local people suffer. And I don't think anyone had actually made that connection. Because a lot of the people that have been trying to protect the wetlands were protecting them on the old-fashioned and I think outdated argument, oh, it's important for biodiversity. People weren't talking about it's important for food, it's important for regulating the local climate, it's important for local medicines. People were talking about, oh, we're losing fishing cat. Now, if you want to build a hotel, you don't care about fishing cat. You care about money, you care about what's in it for you. Whereas if you actually say, no, this is really important for all the people around, the government, the people in power are actually thinking, okay, maybe that's the decision we have to make, which is for the benefit of the greater population rather than a small subset of the population. So, yeah, it was quite successful in that sense.
And this is only for the wetland.
Yeah.
So can we go with the different activities?
In terms of different threats?
Yeah.
Yes.
Pollution and
Absolutely, yeah. So what we also looked at was, I mean, the main driver in Colombo is infilling, because they want development land, and the only land left is the wetlands. But yeah, we also looked at what happens if you pollute these wetlands. In terms of the way that some of the management, Colombo as a city is a bit like the city of Venice in Europe, in Italy. There are many canals. And the way the canals were being managed, the sediment in the canal was being dumped on the side of the wetlands, and it was stopping the wetlands from flooding. So in terms of canal management, that was impacting and reducing the level of services. Water quality, pollution, that was affecting it. So we could show these links with other factors. So it wasn't just infilling. We did show other human impacts and how they affected the services. One graph I didn't put up because it was quite a complicated graph. What we could do is we could map the trajectory, the way that the wetlands would change depending on different pressures. And when you went from a relatively intact, well-functioning area of wetland, and there are some still left in Colombo, like Colonel Marsh, to a very degraded wetlands, you could see as you went on that trajectory which services you lose. So if you start infilling, or if you start polluting, or if you start changing the hydrology, and you could actually map the trajectory that was really clear. Because we had 63 different wetlands, some of those were in good condition, some of those were in really poor condition. We didn't just focus on the nice stuff, we looked at the really bad wetlands as well. You could actually see how you lose services. And for different types of wetland, whether they were a freshwater wetland, because there are some brackish wetlands in Colombo, they go on slightly different trajectories because they have slightly different pressures on them. And you could see, and again, I didn't put the graph up, but again in our report, it showed that if you carry on polluting these and draining these and changing the hydrology, you lose these services. So we could actually show that quite clearly. Okay, this is the last example I want to go through before we go for lunch. This is something which I've been working on the last 2 or 3 years. We've been doing some work in Myanmar being funded by the Norwegian government, as part of a bilateral project between Norway and the government in Myanmar. And this is a site called Mwinji. It's the first Ramsar site in Myanmar. It's sort of in the southeast of the country. It was built by the British in about 1880, 1890 as a storage reservoir. So on these sides, which you can see are very straight, there are big banks and the rivers flow into it and it collects water. It holds over 20,000 water birds. It's got more than 1% of the global population of northern pintail, a whole range of other ecological interests. And as I said, first Ramsar site in Myanmar, but it doesn't have a management plan. So myself and a couple of colleagues have been working with the site manager to get the site manager and the local staff to develop a management plan for this site. And this has been part of a bigger capacity building program in Myanmar. And so we've been involving site managers from several different wetlands across the site, including the ones that our friends at the back are involved in, who've been coming and helping with the development of this. What we did, we wanted to understand the ecosystem services because we can't define the ecological character of the site unless we know the ecosystem services. So we reviewed some reports, we trained the local staff in how to use it, exactly as we've trained you, and we also trained other wetland managers in Myanmar, including our friends at the back's bosses, their site managers. And we also trained them in a degree of community engagement as well, because, again, taking this hierarchical approach, if we want to get a qualitative assessment, but we also wanted some quantitative data as well. And then we synthesized everything, and the things we really were interested in was linking the benefits, the services to who benefits, which villages around, which stakeholders benefit from this site. And can we understand those spatial relationships around the wetland, how people interact with the wetland? Because if we can do that, and if we can understand the livelihoods, we can maybe identify threats, and then we can put in place the right management to reduce the impact of those threats. And ultimately, this gives us a much more robust and clear definition of the ecological character of the Ramsar site. So we provided training to the site managers. You will recognise that probably. And there's me giving the training. This is my colleague Christine, who's from Australia. So you will recognise some of these people. I think some of the people at the back might recognise Zotu and Mong Win sitting there, who are their bosses. And we trained them exactly the same as we trained you. And we went out and we did assessments of different parts of the wetland. Exactly the same exercise you've been through. We also brought in a colleague of mine, Ritesh Kumar from India, who's done a lot of work on stakeholder engagement and livelihood systems. So we could understand, once we'd done the qualitative assessment, a little bit more about how the different communities engaged with the wetland and what sort of benefits they received, and trying to understand how those livelihood systems worked. And so this is us involved in some stakeholder engagement, and these are a couple of the livelihoods, fisheries and collecting of fibre. And a previous study that had been produced looked at only a few services. We identified, and this is exactly the same, what we've done is just add up for different parts of the wetland, open water habitat, areas of floating grassland, lotus bed, of plantation, there's a little bit of plantation. We added the scores together, then divided it. So again, using the same scale, just to show the full range of services. We had over 40 services that the site was providing. And we can see some of these we subdivided. So food, we didn't just have one category. We had fish, rice, sort of shrimp, mollusks, and food, which was plant. So we subdivided it. Fresh water, we subdivided it into rice farming inside or outside. So again, using the local context. We didn't just use the list, we modified the list to the local context. And again, some of these, we sort of looked at breaking these down in terms of, so noise and visual buffering, we broke down to engine noise from boats. So again, we took the list as a starting point, and then we made our own local context to that list. And what we said is if the service was occurring at over 60%, we thought it was basically widespread. And what we identified was 7 services which we felt were widespread across the whole site, most of them supporting, but also water regulation and cultural services of aesthetic and social relationships. Interestingly, if you look at any literature on this site, it says the most important service is fish. Well, what we found is there was lots of other services that were probably more important than fish, but no one had actually looked at them. That's all it was. But already this is showing that the site was important for many, many things, not just fish. We produced part of that, looking at the spatial pattern of these services, fed into a zonation plan of the site for management zonation, where we had a core zone, the red areas, a transition zone, and what we called as a wide use zone. And so different services were associated with these zones. So when we were defining the zones, we were thinking about the services. And what we could see is in the core zone, unsurprisingly, you have a lot more supporting services. In the wise use zone, a lot more provisioning services. And so you can look at how spatially within the site you're having different services and you're trying to manage those. So the ecological character of the overall site is slightly different within the different zones. And therefore your management prescriptions within these different zones also take into account the ecosystem services. And here we've just combined into the 4 categories, but we could break that down into the individual services as well. What we didn't suggest doing, but what the site staff did, which I thought was an absolute stroke of genius, is they went out to the local 16 villages around this site, population somewhere around about 45,000, 50,000 people. They went out and did community engagement in these villages to understand the livelihoods. They also got the villagers to do assessments of the site in terms of how does the village, as a beneficiary, what benefits do they get, what services do they get. So we could start looking, as you went around the different villages, and again, we can break these down into the different services, but I've just combined them into the 4. Otherwise the graph gets very messy and you wouldn't be able to read it. But what it shows up is this one village here, which was the furthest village away, actually was showing that provisioning services they saw as a negative because they were excluded. They felt they were a disbeneficiary because they were too far away and they didn't have that local link. But interestingly, virtually all of the villages understood the role of the supporting services. And if you go back to the zonation map, one of the challenges is to stop people doing activities in the area which provides the most supporting services, which is the core zone, so illegal trapping of insects, electrofishing, by explaining, making people realise that actually they depend on those supporting services. When you're then trying to say to them, you've got to stop doing something, they understand much better now that, if we stop doing that, we reduce the amount of fish. We impact on the biodiversity, which we're then getting a livelihood out of. So by using the spatial distribution, and it also gave the site staff an inroad, a direction into which communities did they have to go and talk about for different types of services. So they could target their efforts, rather than saying we treat every village as the same, and we have to go to every village and say you shouldn't do electrofishing. They could find out, again, in terms of which ones were dependent on fisheries, who was doing electrofishing, and then they're the ones you target to try and look at, can you transition those livelihoods away and change it into something positive. So they're just a few examples where you can use this technique and this approach, and you can use the results as really good ways to get dialogue going and to look at management planning. So really what I want to sort of leave it with, and just as a final sort of discussion, is really to throw it over to yourselves. Because you've seen ways we could use it, you've used the tool, it's not, and I don't like using the term tool, it's more of an approach. What are you going to do when you leave here? Are you going to go and train your staff? Are you going to teach your colleagues on how to use this? Are you going to go out and look at your site or other sites? How are you going to do that? How are you going to divide your site up? Are you going to look at it all as one site? What are you going to do with the results? What else are you going to do? Or are you going to go home and go, oh, that was rubbish. I'm never going to use that again. So any suggestions in the room, but also what else would be useful for you? What other training, what other materials would be useful for you? All of my presentations and all the information you'll get as PDFs at the end. So you'll get all this information. So you can have all of this information, that's absolutely fine. But what else would you need? This is being filmed and this will be available as a training video which will be translated into local languages. Mr. Sir and myself will be discussing about producing a manual which initially will be in English but would be, hopefully, if money is available, translated into local languages. So more of a how to do it manual and how you can apply the results and develop the applications. But what else do you think you might need? So I'd like to throw it open to the floor for sort of 5-10 minutes before we have lunch. And if we have some microphones going around.
Actually, in my duty station there is a Fewa lake, lake, and we establish mechanism of the payment of environmental services at that lake. And on the downstream of the lake, there are many hotels, restaurants, and boating agencies, paragliding associations, and many downstream users of that lake. And in the upstream area, there are poor village people who conserve that forest through the community forestry program.
Yeah.
And we establish a mechanism of the lower district community. We establish a committee at the lower level, lower district level, and we also form the committee at the upper district level also.
Right, yeah.
And we made a green sticker, and all the hotels on the downstream pay 6,000 Nepali rupees
Right, yep.
as a environmental services
Yes.
to the upstream community. And we formed a independent committee, which is board of the directors, which is on the chair of the Institute of Forestry College. And this board of directors and executive body carried out the environmental control of the environmental degradation program in the upstream area. So this is very good insight for me that I will go there and I firstly assess what are the environmental services over there, and it will be very helpful for me to put the appropriate valuation of the services that now it's the wrong value that one hotel pays just 6,000 rupees.
Yeah.
It's very nominal. And it is still hard to convince them. They are saying that we are paying tax to the government, we are registered legally, and why we pay extra money for the environmental services? And this would be the valuable guidelines for me to convince them that you are getting such kind of benefit from here, so you have to pay.
Yeah.
This is very good guideline for me.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that, I've used this as well in another situation in the UK where this whole idea of payment for ecosystem services, payment for the benefits that nature is providing other parts of society. In that case, the downstream users are paying the upstream people. You can use this very much for that, even though you're not quantifying how much those services are worth in a monetary sense. If you can show that your wetland, the people downstream are benefiting from all of these things, then they need to pay for that benefit. And so even if you don't quantify or monetize that, you can say, look, you're getting these multiple benefits. And therefore, and one of the things in Colombo we discussed is that new hotel developments which are being built next to the wetlands, maybe there should be a tax on those hotels because they're benefiting from being next to the wetland in terms of the air quality, in terms of the climate regulation, in terms of the aesthetics. All these services they're getting for free. But they can charge a premium rate for their hotel because it overlooks the wetland. So you can use this approach to say, look, you need to pay something to maintain that view or to maintain those services. And if you know all those services, it gives you a stronger argument, even if you don't monetize them.
There are more than 18,000 user groups formed in Nepal.
Yeah.
More than 18,000. And community forests. And government of Nepal has been handed over forest to that community, and they have autonomous right. They have right. They can do everything.
That's right.
To
Yeah.
that forest. And I firstly identify those community forests who have wetland also.
Yes.
And then, because I am now working under the Ministry of Forest
Right.
and Environment, so I will design to train training package for all those. I will design the training package for all those. I will propose in the ministry to design training for all those community forests who have wetlands. And before that, some local staffs from the district forest office we will design to train
Right.
those, so that there could be easy to train also the community.
And then they can train the community. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Brilliant. And look, you're probably not aware, but I've also been talking to your national focal point for the Ramsar Convention. He was at the Ramsar pre-COP meeting in Asia, in Sri Lanka, and I gave a similar presentation in terms of the draft resolution on this, and he was very interested to get me to Nepal to help do very much that, to get a whole group of people in for training, with the idea that you train your staff, those staff then go out and train other people. So, but I think one of the real challenges in that is what I call quality control. And this isn't meant as a criticism of individuals. It's making sure that some of the sort of, not mistakes, but sort of errors in judgment that people were making on certain services as we went through this repeated. So you have to make sure that training is quite robust and that they understand what they're doing. Ultimately, it might not make a huge difference, but it is important to try and maintain that quality, and that's why some training materials as reference documents could be quite useful. But that's a really good idea, to train people that they can take it out to more people.
And in Sri Lanka, we have 6 Ramsar sites, and in my national park in Bundala, we also doing the same things.
Right.
Mentioned. Especially we working with community
Yep.
using livelihood program and empowerment program. So I think it's very good for me, especially for my management.
Yes.
So and my future decisions. It's very good tool. I think it's very good tool for me to get my decisions, get my right decisions.
Yes.
And even I hope to, when I go back to my country, I hope to discuss with my top management to go with this process to all Ramsar sites.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So maybe a target for translation would be into...
Especially
the
handbook.
Yes. Yeah. Any?
Mine is just suggestion.
Yes.
I feel it is not fair enough just to value the ecosystem services that a wetland provide based on the number of beneficiaries in the present scenario.
Right, okay.
Not focusing on potential benefits.
Right.
For instance,
Yeah.
the wetland harbor a wide variety of fishes, but it is not benefiting,
Yeah.
and it is not used for consumption of these beneficiaries, but it has a potential benefit. I am just suggesting that why not add a column in the assessment sheet describing these potential benefits.
Yeah, I think that we had a very brief chat about this. And it's interesting because in Bhutan we've done national training on this technique, and already, very much as you suggested, the site managers, of which we have 2 here, have gone to their staff, trained their staff, and have already been implementing this. So it's interesting to hear from that perspective the whole idea of potential benefits. And it's interesting, quite often when I run this sort of training, that's always one of the grey areas. People say, I think there's a benefit, or there's a potential for a benefit, but I can't link it with a beneficiary. That might be because there isn't a link, or it might be that the benefit isn't being provided, but sometimes there is a potential benefit. And a lot of these are usually on the provisioning services rather than the regulating, but even on the regulating there's opportunities, and on the cultural. So I think the idea of actually flagging up, is there a potential for this benefit to be realised? I think as long as there's a note of caution in that, So you don't say to everyone, right, come and get all the fish out of my wetland, and you realise you've got endemic fish that have now disappeared. So as long as there's the appropriate precautions, I think where that's really valuable is where you're looking at livelihood systems. And if you have, and we looked at this in Mwingi, where insect trapping is it's a negative impact on the site. It's indiscriminate. It doesn't just catch insects, it catches birds, it captures every flying insect. And that's having a real impact on the biodiversity. Yet we know that the communities that are doing the insect trapping, because it is seen as a livelihood, it's a service. But when you talk to them and say, okay, we'll stop insect trapping, they say, well, where am I going to get my money from? Out of all the livelihoods, it's the one that generates the most money. The market in China is huge for the insects. So they're trapping insects, selling them illegally over the border. And so if we say, but there are these other livelihoods that you could do, we think the fisheries might be sustainable. You could do some fishing. We can transfer your skills, very much looking at potential services which that community aren't using at the moment. Again, as long as it's done carefully with due caution, I think it is something worth considering without a doubt. And whether that actually goes on the sheet or whether that's just in the comments, you have to make a comment of whether, but I think it's a good idea in terms of potential services, because that might give you a management action which you can implement. So that's a very good suggestion.
Okay. You have mentioned that you have developed a management plan based on your research result of the revenue assessment. Then would you please share the management plan itself with us, then people can read what was your approach, how will you develop the management plan, and it can be a good text.
The simple answer is no, because it's still in consultation with the government. So as soon as it's been approved by the government, yes. But the simple answer at the moment is I'd love to, but the government have their own process that has to go to the review. They have to endorse it before it can be publicly. So I apologise, that's out of my hands. But yes, as soon as it's endorsed, which it should be at the National Wetland Committee meeting next month, then I'd be more than happy to share it.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Rob, for the beautiful lectures. It was really useful, especially for wetland managers who are managing important wetlands in their country. My just curiosity or suggestion or thing is that what next after refuge assessment? Can we quantify our wetlands with some values so that we can attract attention of our government towards more conservation, to attract conservation for wetlands. In the next training, in the future training session, maybe you should tell us something of quantifying our systems.
Yeah, so I see this as very much this hierarchical approach. You've got to do the qualitative assessment first, and then you can quantify. So for instance, at Mwingi, what we did is when we went out and we did the qualitative assessments first. So we did the rapid assessment of the wetlands first. And then when we went out to the local community, we gathered information in terms of especially specific services that we thought were important, but also those services which could be, if they weren't managed, they would become a threat. So fisheries was electrofishing was seen as one, insect trapping, water abstraction. So the livelihoods the services we saw that they were currently happening, because we'd done the qualitative assessment, we then went out and using a very much a participatory approach, we collected information targeting those services. So what you're doing is you're moving up the hierarchy, you're focusing in on the things you really want to get information on. So we collected information in terms of how many people go fishing, numbers of fish they catch, and then some of those we could then quantify in an economic sense. But I always say you have to take the qualitative approach first, so you know the full range of benefits. And it might be just knowing those full range of benefits, as we had in Colombo, was enough to communicate the messages you want to communicate. But yeah, the next stage is really to understand the livelihood systems and the economics of it. And that's what we did here. We went out and actually collected. But that was the data we collected was based on our first having that qualitative assessment of all the services. So, I mean, I think that's really a question for Mr. Sir and other people, is whether we want to have a next round of training which would take you to that next stage, because that's a different set of skills you need. But again, we train the staff at Mwingi and other wetland managers, including Monwin, who you know very well, to go out, and they collected these data. We didn't collect them. They went out to the 16 villages and collected the data themselves. They did some of the data processing. We just did some of the synthesis. So yeah, you can do this, and it's quite easy to train. We had a 2-day training session in Myanmar on this, so that training could be provided. It takes that to the next level, yeah. Okay.
No more reactions.
But if anyone has any other ideas, I'm going to be around for the rest of the afternoon as well. So if you want to catch me, that's fine, or email me subsequently. But as I said, all the materials will be shared.
So let's give Rob a big hand.